Hi everyone, good morning. I think we'll start the webinar now as people slowly trickle in. Thank you for joining us today for webinar with Dr. Aude Bernard. We'll be talking about internal migration and its policy implications. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we proceed with the presentation, I would like to welcome our senior research director, Alizan Mahadi, to give some welcoming remarks. Please.
Thank you, Min. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all and welcome to the ICES webinar on the geography of migration in Asia, trends, patterns, and policy implication. Now, this webinar is, of course, part of our efforts at ICES Malaysia to be a platform to share and exchange ideas on strategic and policy relevant issues. And as we move along, we hope to host more of these things, and hopefully soon we can see many of you also in person within ICES as we start to host more and more events moving forward. Now, at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Aude Bernard for her willingness to share her very interesting research with us. For everyone's information, Dr. Aude Bernard is a demographer at the University of Queensland. She works on internal migration in partnership with international organizations and government departments on a range of theoretical, methodological, and applied issues. Her contributions to formal demography include developing measurement and estimation techniques that facilitate large-scale international comparisons on migration levels, patterns, and selectivity. Now, often as researchers, especially from think tanks, policy and development challenges are often explained through perhaps economic or governance lenses and approaches. But studying societal development and demographic change, and essentially studying human beings, can also be very useful to explain certain development scenarios, and is often perhaps overlooked as both a cause and solution to some of the challenges we face today. Furthermore, when you talk about migration, often we think about international migration, but sometimes we miss out the significance of internal migration. Let's take the context of Malaysia, for example. In 1970, the rural population was about 70%, while the urban population was about 30%. By 2010, that has completely reversed, and now we have an urban population of about 77%. So it's worth reflecting what are the impacts and implications to this. Now, broadly speaking, internal migration is seen as a crucial mechanism for enabling labor market flexibility, occupational progression, and as a consequence, social mobility. And as a developing country, the internal migration in Malaysia certainly allowed for social mobility of millions of populations. Moving forward, as we aim for being a high-income nation, as we progress along in our development, what is its implication on development and what are the policy implications? Analysis of international migration can be useful to guide policy discussions such as these and on urban planning, urbanization, and economic development. More broadly, a comparative approach across countries to internal migration allows for new insights into dynamics and a key opportunity to discuss the intersection of migration and public policy and how this might lead to better policies by adopting an evidence-based approach. Dr. Aude Bernard's presentation takes on an interesting focus of measuring and explaining cross-national variations in the level of internal migration, age, and educational selectivity of internal migration, its impact on the distribution of human settlement, and its link to international migration. And I'm sure it will provide interesting findings on its implication to development and policy. At ICES Malaysia, as a think tank, we are always on the lookout for interesting topics such as these, as well as providing a platform to think about how this relates to policy and action. So I hope, and I'm sure, everyone will benefit from this session today and have an interesting discussion on the findings of Dr. Bernard, but also more generally on using such techniques to understand and develop solutions to the challenges we face. With that now, I have the honor of inviting Dr. Aude Bernard to deliver her presentation. Dr. Aude, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alison, for your kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. And as Alison said, I'm a demographer at the University of Queensland, where I work on migration issues. I'm interested in understanding the determinants of migration, why people migrate, but also the implications for individuals, their families, but also regions and communities. And so today I'll present results from a couple of projects done in partnerships with colleagues across Asia. So I'll share my screen with you now. So hopefully you can see my screen. Yeah. All right. So the motivation for this work is the growing interest in migration, not only in Malaysia and Asia, but really right around the world. And an important reason that we need to remember is that in most countries around the world, we now live in a demographic regime of low fertility. I was looking at the numbers, for Malaysia before this morning before coming, and I read that the total fertility rate, the average number of children per woman, is now 1.7. The latest figure for Australia is 1.6, which is the lowest ever on record. So meaning that women have less than 1.6 children on average. And if you look at East Asia, at countries like South Korea, Hong Kong, it's close to 1 or below, and even in countries in particularly in East and Southern Europe, it's now very low, around 1.1 or 1.3 children per woman. Now, in that context of low and extremely low fertility, this means that migration has become the main driver of population change. The only way you can change the size and the composition of your population is through migration. And so in that context, we really expect migration to play an increasing role, both migration within countries and also within countries. Now, you all know economically, as Alison mentioned, that migration is also important economically by bringing skills and knowledge where they are needed for the effective functioning of the labor markets. And so in the second half of the presentation, I'll also look at the link between education and migration in the Malaysian and Asian context. But this is also complicated by the fact that migration is obviously also a social and a political issue. Now, despite the importance of migration, I think it's fair to say that we don't really understand migration well. And there is really a lack of research, comparative research compared to mortality and fertility, which are the other drivers of population change. One of the reasons people are often surprised that we don't really have good migration data. It's actually difficult to get migration data. And linked to this, we don't have measures that all researchers and the UN and other organizations agree on. I gave you the example of fertility. In fertility, we have the total fertility rate. To talk about mortality, we have the life expectancy and other measures. We don't have these commonly agreed upon measures that we can use. And so for that reason, we don't have a lot of comparative research trying to understand how migration processes vary between countries and how they impact the local populations. So some work we did a few years ago here at the University of Queensland with this image project, where we tried to gather data and methods to do so, focusing on internal migration. Now, before I show you the results, I think it's important to reflect on why we want to have a comparative approach to migration. And there are a number of reasons to do so. It really forces us as researchers to really be rigorous and develop measures and approaches that we can compare between countries. But I think it's really also really important to understand, what's happening within a given country. If you look at results for Malaysia, it's very difficult to interpret them if we don't compare them to other countries. And this also helps us really understand the nexus between migration and policy. And I really try to make these links throughout the presentation. Before going any further, it's really important to define migration because there are so many different ways we can define it. And what I'm talking about today is internal migration, so migration within countries. I'm not looking at residential mobility, which is short distance, and I'll just look at international migration between countries at the very end. One of the reasons for focusing on internal migration, which is often forgotten, there is a lot of media attention on international migration, a lot of emphasis on international migration by the UN as well and other agencies. But numerically, if you look around the world, actually internal migrants, so people moving within countries, outnumber international migrants by a factor of at least 4 to 1. And, we estimate that around the world, there are about 1 billion people, or 1 in 8, that live within the country of birth, but in a different region than the region of birth. So the scale of internal migration is actually very significant. So as I said, a few years ago, we developed this project, the IMAGE project, to start understanding how internal migration processes vary between countries. And I'm not going through the details of this project. It was very methodological, but a few years ago, we thought, actually, we have data now for countries around the world. And, as a member of the Asia-Pacific regions, we should really focus on Asia to try to better understand what's going on in the region. And so what we did is we brought, techniques and new statistics and thought, well, really to interpret them, we need also to have the context, the local context. And so we teamed up with researchers all across Asia to try to interpret these results in context. And we also did so in an effort to build capacity in migration research in the region. And this work was done in partnership with the Asian Demographic Research Institute at Shanghai University. And here you can see a framework over many years. We had a number of workshops, particularly in Shanghai, trying to bring a number of researchers from Asia and go through this data together to understand what's going on. So in the first half of the presentation, I'll show you some of these results from this project. Now, you're based in Malaysia, so I don't need to tell you about the diversity that we found within Asia. And our goal really was to have as many countries across the region as we could. But actually, it was more difficult than we thought. And we have only 15 countries, you can see listed here. Now, we didn't manage to get a scholar from Malaysia, unfortunately, but we do have data from Malaysia. So I'll show you some of these results. And you can see, so that here, the 15 countries for which we could find data and a scholar to work with. And that really speak about the challenges of finding access to good data and the local resources to do this analysis, and hence the importance in the region of capacity building as well. Now, migration is very complex. There are many different dimensions. I won't go through them in detail, but really in this project, we looked at 3 different dimensions, which we think are really important if you want to understand migration processes. So one of them is looking at the level. How high is migration? How the level of migration within the country is changing over time, and how does it compare against country? The second dimension we'll be looking at today is the spatial impact of migration, which is essential. How much population is redistributed within a country? It's very complex to measure. It's not only the product of migration, of the level of how many people migrate, it also depends on the direction. So if you have as many people living in Kuala Lumpur as you have people moving in every year, the effect on the population redistribution could be close to 0. So we need to look not only at the level of migration, but also how it interacts with the direction of flows. And the last point I'd like to look at today is the selectivity of migration, because this is the way migration can change the composition of a population. And we looked at age and education. It's really because these are really the 2 key factors from a policy perspective, how we can change the age structure of a regional population and its educational profile. And today, in the interest of time, I'll just look at education, which is increasingly important. And so you can find more detail if you're interested in this book. Okay, so moving on to some results. Here we're looking at the overall level of migration. What proportion of the population in a given country changed place of residence within a 5-year interval? Now, this has a horrible name, aggregate crude migration intensities. But the truth is, it's very difficult to compare migration between countries because migration is measured at different spatial scales. So for example, changing state of residence in Malaysia doesn't mean the same thing as changing state of residence in Australia, for example, because the size of the country is different. States have different size and different functions. So we cannot compare them between countries. So here we came up with a technique. I'm not going to talk about the statistics behind, but to estimate actually all changes of address within a 5-year period. That's the only way we can actually compare the level of internal migration between countries without being affected by differences in the spatial structure of a country. Now, here are the results for a number of Asian countries. And you can see clearly there are huge variations between countries, from a high of over 50% in South Korea, which is telling you every 5 years more than 50% of the population changes place of residence, which is significant, compared to a low of 5% in India, which is one of the lowest levels in the world. You can also see the global mean, because we did this for all over the world. So the global mean is 21%. And you can see that the level of migration in Asia is slightly below, and about 17% of the population moving every 5 years. And Malaysia sits right on the Asian average here. Now, interestingly, if we replicate the analysis around the world, we find that typically the level of mobility tends to be higher in highly developed countries, and the association between the level of internal migration and the level of human development, the Human Development Index, is about 0.5, 0.6%, so moderate association. So really high level, you can see here in South Korea and Japan, which is the most highly developed countries. But you can see also some countries you might be surprised, like Mongolia or Kyrgyzstan. And we go back to this, how this is really underpinned by government efforts to relocate some of the population. So there can be some policy intervention as well. So these are just like a very broad picture to give you kind of some context on the level of internal migration. This is the same data at a global scale. So for countries for which we could get some data, and you can see what I was talking about, the fact that the level of migration tend to be higher in Northern America, Australasia, so Australia, New Zealand, and also the North and the West of Europe. And Asia stands out overall, despite variations within the region, as a low mobility country. So I forgot to say that the dark blue and the blue are the low mobility countries, and the red and the darker the red, the higher the level of migration. So we see these kind of regional patterns around the globe, Asia standing out as a moderate level of mobility. But at the same time, there are huge variations between regions. Europe is really interesting because in Europe, we have really high mobility in the north and the west, low mobility in the east and the south. And this is the product of historical forces, cultural practices, a number of factors we'll go back to in the presentation. So this is really kind of the global picture, thinking about level of internal migration. Now, something that's particularly important for policymakers is thinking how the level of migration might change. Is changing over time? Is it increasing, decreasing? So in Australia and the US, in the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a significant decline in the level of internal migration. So while we remain one of the most mobile countries in the world, in Australia, the level of interstate migration has declined by 30% since the 80s and close to 50% in the US. So it's significant. And the number of factors, we can go back to it at the end if you're interested, population aging, increasing participation of women in the labor force. These type of changes tend to anchor people down. And that's useful to think about it in the context of developing countries that might follow similar trends in the future. But we wanted to look more closely in Asia, and it's very difficult to get good data on trends, because you need countries who have good data. They tend to have access to administrative data for population registers, and they're not commonly found. So we thought we had to be a bit creative in how we look at trends. And so what we did, actually, we said, wait a second, in some countries, we don't only know the proportion of people who moved in the last 5 years, and I should say this is all data based on censuses. We know also the proportion of people who live in a country other than the country of birth. So what we did, we took the ratio of what we call lifetime migration, so the proportion of people who live in a region other than the region of birth, to the proportion of people who changed in the last 5 years. And so a low ratio, basically, like you see in China and Cambodia, a low ratio tells you that the country is currently experiencing a period of high migration compared to the past. And these high ratios, as you have, for example, in Malaysia, which is the highest in Asia, tells you the reverse, that you're actually in a period of migration is lower than it used to be. So even if we don't have laid out migration trends, we can start understanding what's going on in a country. So here you can see those countries with a ratio under 3. These are countries like Mongolia, China, that are going through rapid urbanization. And so they have these very large flows. But you also see countries like Sri Lanka or Cambodia that are highly mobile, but for different reasons. In fact, we see the reverse in Sri Lanka and Cambodia in recent years. It's been a lot of urban to rural flow. And we'll go back to those. These are linked to, the end of the war in Cambodia, in Sri Lanka, and some different economic structures in Cambodia. Sorry. But at the top, you find countries like Malaysia, and Indonesia and Thailand that are very urbanized. And so in those countries, we expect migration to is slowing down, and we expect it to slow it down farther. Whereas India is really interesting because India is a bit of an outlier. It has a very low level of migration compared to its level of development. And we think that's because instead of migrating permanently and relocating, in India, people circulate. So you have a lot of temporary migration, or people might move to the city for 3 or 6 months in the year and then come back to a rural village. And so you don't see this type of large, permanent internal migration flow. Now, for 3 Asian countries, we found a long time series going back to the 50s. And this is Japan, the solid line, South Korea, here at the top, and Mongolia. Now, the first thing I should say that we cannot compare these between countries, the actual level, because the different spatial scale, it's prefectures, migration between prefectures in Japan, it's a different spatial scale in South Korea. But if you look, for example, at the trend in Japan and South Korea, it's very interesting. You can see that, when Japan developed and grew and urbanized very rapidly in the 50s, it had this high increase in internal migration. So did South Korea, and since then it's been decreasing. And that the decline I also talked about, in Australia, in the US. This is the same in, some highly urbanized, highly developed countries in Asia. What I think is really interesting, you can see, looking at South Korea, how early on you tend to have this high fluctuation, this annual variation. And as the country develops, it tends to flatten. We don't have this huge variation. And we see the same in Australia. And if you look at data from the 70s to today, even COVID hasn't impacted migration that much because mechanism, for example, through welfare provision, that makes that people are not as affected by up and down swings in the economic cycle. And also that's useful if you want to start thinking, how you may forecast the level of migration for planning purposes. This is something to think about. Also, if you look at Mongolia here at the bottom, you can see how it has really significant ups and downs. And this is because Mongolia has a much more agricultural kind of economic structure. And so they're much more influenced by periods of droughts and significant weather events. So again, that's information that's useful if you want to think about how migration may change the level in the future. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is understanding, not only the level of migration, but where people are going. To understand the spatial impact of migration, that's essential from a planning perspective. So how many people are actually redistributed within a country? And here on this diagram, you can see a hypothetical country with 4 regions. It doesn't exist. And you can see flows between different regions. So if you look at region A, for example, you can see the outflows in red and flows from other regions coming in. Now, in that region, the size of inflows, people moving in, and outflows is the same. And So you can have a situation where you have a very high level of migration, but you have absolutely no effect, no impact on population redistribution. And so we need to look at this, understanding how we have flows and counterflows that can cancel each other out. And so we've done some work. I'm not going to go through the details. So we thought we can look at an aggregate measure for the whole country that actually tells us how much of the population is redistributed. And so on the next slide, we're looking at this. That's a normalized measure, again, to compare between the different Asian countries. And basically, here, if you have an index that's above 1, it tells you that migration is more effective in redistributing the population than the Asian mean. And if you're below 1, it's less effective. So if you look at a country like Mongolia, it really stands out. This means that migration is very effective in redistributing the population. And if you dig in the data, you will see that Mongolia combines a very high level of migration and also flows that are not balanced. So we see redistribution. China is interesting. It has also, although it has a low level of migration, so China by Asian and international standards have a low level of internal migration, but it's still very effective in redistributing the population way above the Asian mean, because also flows in China are very asymmetrical. They're all concentrated mainly towards the east coast of China, and very limited flows in the reverse direction. So again, it's useful to put these different countries in perspective to understand what's going on and also how things might change in the future. If you look at the bottom, you have a country like Japan that tells you that basically migration doesn't really redistribute people within countries. That's what we say low spatial impact. That's about 1/7, of the mean. And the reason is Japan has a very high level of migration, but flows balance each other out. And so we have a very kind of balanced spatial structure. Now I look at Malaysia, the level of redistribution is low by Asian standard, and that may surprise, some urban planners or policy makers working in the field. Many years ago, we did some work in Iran, which you can see here, and Iran, it's very low as well by Asian standard. Now, the Iranian government has for a long time been really concerned about the level of population movement to the capital city, but when you put this in context, it's actually not that high. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have pockets within the country. And for each country, we actually have, region-specific results to understand what's going on. You can have pockets where you have really high redistribution, but nationally, it's still quite low. So before moving on to education, I'd like to think about where people are going. So we've been talking about this, and something that's really important as countries urbanize and thinking of the direction, the share of rural to urban flows, or flows between urban centers. The challenge for us is that the data on rural to urban migration is not very usable, and it's not comparable between countries and over time. So what urban means and how it's defined in Malaysia is going to be very different to, for example, what's in Cambodia. So in Cambodia, a village of 50,000 people or even 20,000 people might be considered urban. Whereas it's not the case in Australia or perhaps in Malaysia either. That's one of the problems. And the problem is that what it means to be urban keeps on changing. At each census, it's often refined within the countries. And so it's very difficult to use this data. So we thought we have to find another way. And I think that perhaps a more useful way is to think about population density, which is really comparable between countries and over time. And so here what we did, it's an example for Mongolia. We have the population density on the x-axis for each region within the country. So each dot is actually here, each marker is a region, and on the y-axis, we have the migration rate for that region. So if you have a positive migration rate, these are regions that are gaining population through migration. And if you have a negative rate below 0, these are regions that are losing population because of migration. And in the case of Mongolia, you can see that all the net gains, the net population gains, are to the most densely populated region. And the losses occur in areas that have low population density. So just looking at the slope of this line, we can tell that this is a country where there is a large rural to urban flows that contribute to urbanization. And so, this is the only theoretical slide I have in this presentation. But then we thought, okay, we need to think from policy and planning perspective, how this direction of flows and population redistribution is going to change as the country urbanizes and as the country develops. And so that's what you see here on the time, which is the y-axis. And what it's telling us is that when you really low urbanization, low level of development, the slope is quite flat. There's a bit of movement from rural to urban, but it's slow. Here, as countries develop, you reach this peak that I think Malaysia has definitely passed of really intense rural to urban migration. Then it slows down, and then in many countries, it turns negative. Many countries reach a phase of suburbanization or even counter-urbanization. People don't agglomerate in the city center anymore, but can go to peripheral region, which is probably where Malaysia is. But I think what's interesting when we think about the future is this last phase that's really based on our observation of what has happened in Europe, Australia, and Japan, and also North America. Is that basically there are very different patterns depending on the countries. There are some countries that you are going to find in East and South Europe, or we still see increased urbanization, and we still have a large movement from rural and urban centers, which really lead to a significant rural depopulation. We see the reverse in some countries, particularly in a country like the UK, or we've seen a counter-urbanization. People moving, really to peripheral regional areas in search of sea change or tree change, and really making the most of these natural amenities. And to some extent, we've seen this a bit in Australia since COVID, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Malaysia. And then you have a third type of countries. The slope is flat. It's very, it's what we call a dynamic equilibrium. Nothing is really changing, and the flows are really balanced between rural and urban setting. So just kind of a conceptual framework to think what these slopes actually mean for countries based on their level of development. So here are the results for Asia based on this slope. And so the higher the slope, the more rural to urban migration you have. And you can see a positive but moderately positive slope in Malaysia, which clearly is linked to the fact that these large rural to urban flows have diminished. And then thinking about the future, how they may return, possibly turn negative, as we've seen, for example, in South Korea, Iran, and Indonesia. And you see at the top, Nepal, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, China. These are countries that are going where they have really strong rural to urban flows that dominate the internal migration system. Now, what we did in this next graph is thought, okay, to really understand what's going on, we've put the slope, so the same data on the y-axis, but again, the proportion of people living in urban areas to see the relationship. So countries along the line, the country that really conform to the theory, and that's where Malaysia sits. So in Malaysia, we have the type of flows we would really expect in terms of the direction for a country at this level of urbanization, so close to 80%. And so is South Korea, Japan. If you think of a country like China, that's less urbanized, again, it makes sense to see these large rural to urban flows. And as I said, this just simple line is very useful to position a country and then think how it might evolve, and the direction of flows will evolve as a country urbanizes. Now, what's interesting is to look at outliers, countries that have very different migration processes. Now, Sri Lanka, for example, for this very low level of urbanization, we would expect much larger rural to urban flows, and yet it's not occurring. So digging a bit deeper, in Sri Lanka, it's the result of a lot of policy initiatives to have economic development initiatives in rural areas to keep people. And this seems to have worked. And it's coupled with the end of the civil war a few years ago, which has led to a massive return of population from urban center back to rural centers of origin. In India, as I said, it's a different process. It's a very low level of migration, and instead of migration, we have this circulation. And so people go to urban centers, but only at temporarily and come back. Cambodia, this is linked to economic structures that are remain very turn around agriculture and extraction. And Myanmar, it's more like a policy, perhaps a policy intervention and a constraint on migration. You can see on the other hand here, Mongolia that stands out. It has perhaps an unusually high level of rural to urban migration for its level of development. And this is because the government has active policies to resettle people. So this is just some examples to tell you that, there are two things really, I think, that are two key messages. On one hand, you have you have ways to shape your migration. And we've seen some things that are a bit unusual, and that could be, government using policy instruments. I didn't talk about Indonesia, but Indonesia has also very successful in the terms that they actually managed to change the distribution of people through policy intervention. And you may also know that Indonesia is changing the location of its capital city. That's an example of such policy intervention. But also, I think there are some regularities that we can think about to help us think how things might change in the future. So based on this evidence and evidence we also assemble for the regions in the world, we expect as the country urbanizes and develops that the level of internal migration will increase, but its redistributive effects will diminish as flows become more and more balanced. We also expect that there's this fluctuation from year to year that are linked to severe weather events that impact crops, or economic downturns will affect highly developed countries less because they have strategies to buffer them, and so population are less likely to be displaced. And we expect, as is probably happening now in Malaysia, a growing share of flows between urban centers coupled with suburbanization, or perhaps even counter urbanization, or a growth in peripheral rural areas, as we've seen in some parts of Europe. And these kind of processes are useful to think of from a policy perspective. Now, I'll move briefly to the last dimension that I like to think about, that's really moving beyond the level and the direction of migration, thinking about who migrates and why. And what I'll be focusing on is education. And the reason to do so is that we know now that there is, that migration is fundamental to the process of human development, and it really facilitates the acquisition of human capital and its redistribution. So for individuals, it's really important for people to meet their goals, including, education. But we know that education also facilitates migration. The more educated you are, the more you'll be able to face the cost of migration, but also you tend to have higher returns on migration. Now, if you look at the literature, whether it's internal and international migration, the link between education and migration is not very clear. In most studies, it seems to suggest that more educated people are more likely to migrate, but there's not a lot of evidence from countries outside, Europe and North America. And so that's what we wanted to do, kind of started thinking, what is going to happen to migration and highly educated people as education expands? And so here we looked at the educational selectivity of migrants. That's work we did for the UNESCO a few years ago for a global sample of countries. And the question we're really interested is that what is the link between migration and education? Is it the case that in all countries, the more highly educated people are more likely to migrate or not? And how does this relationship really varies depending on the level of development of a country? Very clearly, very briefly, here we managed to expand the sample. We have a global sample. We then focused on Asia of 56 countries that represent 65% of the population. And here we did some regression analysis. We simply mean that we control for differences between people in terms of sex, age, labor force status, urban status, and so forth. And so the results I'm presenting or what we call, I'll talk about this later, but just looking at some of the results to see if migration is selective with respect to education. So is there a statistically significant relationship between the probability of migrating and your educational level? So in a sample of countries, we found that in all countries, at least one level of education is significant. And I look at less than primary, secondary, tertiary. In 80% of countries, both secondary and tertiary education is significant. So there is a relationship. And in 75 countries, all level of education are statistically significant. And only in 3 countries, you can see listed here, there is no relationship between tertiary education and migration. Now, the next obvious question is, what is the direction of this relationship? So here are the results for, if you look on the right, for all the countries in the sample. And this is telling you that compared to people with no education, people with primary education are 1 times more likely to migrate, similar for those for secondary education. But those with tertiary education globally are 1.3 times more 2.4 times or so more likely to migrate. And so this suggests that there is a very strong association, and you can see that it holds in all regions of the world, including in Asia. So in Asia, tertiary educated people are 2.3 times more likely to migrate than those who haven't completed primary education. And so here, looking at the results for individual countries, you can see clearly that Malaysia, and again, I'm sorry, the data, census data is a bit dated because it's really difficult to access data. And that's something we can talk about separately, but you can see clearly that Malaysia stands out. It has the highest level of educational selectivity of all Asian countries and pretty much all countries in our sample except a couple. So this is telling you that in Malaysia, people with tertiary education are close to 6 times more likely to migrate than people who haven't completed primary education. And you know, when you think about it, it's really important from a policy perspective because tertiary educated people are really, you know, they bring these skills and knowledge where they need to be. They often migrate for employment purposes, which you might think might be great for the, you know, effective functioning of the labor market. At the same time, and this is valid for the countries, you really want to think about these people who are low level of education to make sure they don't get stuck in place. And they have the skills that allows them to move. And this is really important if you think about it in the context of economic restructuring. So for example, in Australia, we have some regions that heavily depend on manufacturing, then the key factories close, and then we have a high pocket of unemployment of people who have never migrated in their life and actually are really very unlikely to migrate even if they lose their job because of changes in economic structure. And we've done some work separately showing that, you know, kids who've been exposed to migration early in life, including internal migration, are more likely to migrate when they're adults because they kind of learn the skills and realize the benefits that migration can bring. And so it's really important that we make sure when we think about this, that nobody is left behind. Now, this is the last set of results very briefly is kind of extending this analysis to think about what it means for international migration. What is the educational profile of international migrants? But here we focused on return migrants. So for example, people who left Malaysia and came back. What is the educational profile? Are they more or less qualified than the people who stayed in Malaysia? And the reason for doing so is that there is growing recognition that return migrants account for a growing share of the global migration system. You know, estimates ranges between 25 to 40% of all flows. And this is linked to this idea that, you know, this idea of one-way permanent migration is obsolete, and that people will migrate multiple times throughout their lives and often return to their countries or circulate between countries. Now, we don't really have good data, and you know, for those of you who work with migration data, you know that the UN data is what we call stock data. It's just based on where, you know, if you live in a country other than the country of birth, you don't know if people migrated in the last 5 years or 50 years. It's not very useful. It's not disaggregated by level of education. So here we used, you know, census data to construct these migration flows by level of education. And here we extended the sample to 60 countries that represent 70% of the world population. Now, here's the share of return migrants in all countries in the sample. The darker the color, the highest the share. And on average, it's about 42% of all migrants within a 5-year, international migrants within a 5-year period of return migrants. And the highest proportion you can see here is in Latin America, 56%. The lowest is in Europe, about 28%, and 37% in Asia. But you can see a lot of variation within the region. And interestingly enough, Malaysia has a lower share of return migrants. So this is telling us that over a 5-year period, only 10% of international migrants are return migrants, which is quite low. It's not necessarily a problem, but it's quite low. And then finally, the last slide really of result, thinking of these people who return to Malaysia after having been abroad, what is their educational profile? Are they more or less educated? Don't look at the formula, but here we use an index that allows us to look at the whole educational distribution, whether you're primary, secondary, or tertiary educated. And if you have an index that's positive, that means that on average, return migrants are more educated than people who stayed, the maximum being 1. That means that basically all return migrants are more educated than the people who stayed. And if the index is negative, it tells you that return migrants are negative or less educated on average. So here are the results for Asia. For the world. And this really emphasized the importance of brain circulation, because in all countries but 6, return migrants are positively selected. So they're on average much more educated than people who stayed. And, it could be because they left highly educated or they gained education overseas. But we cannot identify this in the data, but this is really important. This is showing you the important return migration in bringing skills back home. By looking at the results for Asia, you can see that here Malaysia is doing really well. It's I think the second highest in Asia after China. This is telling you that most migrants who return to Malaysia are actually highly qualified and can economically contribute to the country. And so the last slide for Asia is really looking at this index by age to understand what is the age profile of these highly educated people who return. And you can see here in Malaysia, I think a very nice result is that a lot of these people who come back, they are young people, aged 25 to 34, of prime working age who can contribute to the labor market when they return. And so this has important implication. We want to think of how we return, not only retaining, but letting people go, gain skills, and then bringing them back. And this is very different, for example, to a country like Cambodia, or people who leave and return tend to be less educated on the right-hand side. And the young people who actually are negatively selected when it comes to education. So this is a very brief overview to give you a sense of what can be achieved when we compare migration between countries and trying to understand these processes and what they mean for population redistribution and composition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aude. That was a wonderful presentation, and it's very interesting to see how factors like education and age plays a role in internal migration. And it's something that in Asia we really start thinking about. We have a couple of questions, but before I go to them, I just want to remind everyone you can post questions on the Q&A box down there. It's different from the chat, or you can raise your hands and I can allow you to speak. But if you do that, please try to be concise. Please also let us know your organization, your name, so we can address you correctly. Before we go to some of the questions, I do have some of my own because, I was looking at the research and I found it very interesting. One of the questions that we're grappling with, especially in countries like Southeast Asia, that you also said was about urbanization. So you also said there's also selectivity when it comes to internal migration. What do you think is the profile, based on your research, what do you think is the profile of an internal migrant in Asia? We know that education plays a role in that, but there's also a lot of diversity across the region. And when we talk about rural to urban migration, which probably is one of the key reasons for that, what do you think are the what do you think are the policy implications that arise from this sort of rural to urban migration in Asia?
Well, thanks, Steve, for your question. I think the first part of your question, we're thinking of characteristics, other than education. And so there's been, a lot of work really all around the world trying to think how we explain who migrates and who doesn't. And there are really some factors that hold in every country. The young people, the younger you are, migration peaks in the 20s, early 30s, then it goes down. So the age structure, so the age of people, we talked about the level of education, whether they have dependents or not. We know that if you have dependent, you're less likely to marry. If you own a house, you're less likely to move. Sorry, if you're married, you're less likely to move as well. The longer you've been in a place, the less likely you are to move as well. So there are a number of factors that are consistent regularity that are actually very useful if you want to understand who migrates and who doesn't. But what I find really interesting is that over the years, we keep on doing all this modeling and controlling for all these characteristics. And then we still cannot explain why some people won't migrate, although there are better opportunities elsewhere, and why some people migrate multiple times and others stay put for extended periods of time. And so there's been a lot of interesting work as well coming from psychology, looking at personality traits. And these are very interesting because they're relatively fixed. And there are 5 key personality traits, extraversion, and so forth. And, what colleagues and I have found and others, and there's a growing body of work, is that whether you migrate is strongly associated with your personality traits, and these are very fixed. So people open to new experiences are more likely to migrate. And I think there's not much you can do about it, but it's also very insightful from a policy perspective because there is not much you can actually do about this, the fact that some people will migrate and others will not. What are the implications for Asia? Perhaps I'm more interested in you guys telling you what you think the implications are, from an Asian perspective, and particularly for Malaysia, because it's very country specific. So it's very hard for me to talk about this in detail. But, in the context of Australia, the key challenges, and I don't know, it's probably also to some relevance of Malaysia, is really this problem of urban sprawl, and the fact that our cities keep on extending. So in Australia, where we have very low population density, we can build up. That's quite easy, and it's a new thing for us. Australians used to live in houses, all of them, and it's really relatively new in the last few decades that we have apartment blocks. But I know in Kuala Lumpur, obviously, the situation is very different. And so you cannot keep on building up and densify. But as I was, and there are other ways that are building satellite cities. And I see also a question in the chat about these ideas of whether we can build alternative urban centers or grow rural regions to give them an opportunity to grow and keep people in place, which I know is really a key policy concern in many developing countries. In the Australian context, we've tried for many years to create, kind of second-tier, medium-sized urban, like regional centers with very limited success. And I think one of the reasons is that, businesses need to be located in proximity to each other to benefit from economies of scale, contacts between suppliers and producers and different people in this kind of value-added chains. And so it's making it very difficult if you want to create a regional center that's not going to benefit from having all these businesses in proximity to one another. And so I think that's a challenge for government. It can be a really risky and costly endeavor if it's not done properly. And also the problem, and I think there is a lot of inertia. It's really hard to change. For us, if Sydney and Melbourne have been the cities where people prefer to live for cultural reasons, it's very difficult to change this type of preferences and behavior.
Exactly. All right. I see your point. Then to that, we have a couple of questions that I want to dive deeper into this. Someone wants to ask, Angeline, she wants to ask, how does internal migration in Asia compare to other continents, for example, Europe? And what does it tell us about migration patterns, perhaps in our region?
Thanks, Angelique. That's a very broad question, so I'm not sure how to address it, because as I said, there are many different aspects to migration, whether it's the level, the direction, or the selectivity. So it's a bit difficult for me to answer. One thing I can say that might be useful for Asia is that, like Asia, in Europe, people often talk about Europe, but it's actually very diverse within the European region. And this is reflected in the fact that the level of migration, as I said, is very diverse within Europe. So if you go to the north and the west of Europe, people are much more mobile than the south and the east. And that has continued, for decades and across both cohorts. So it's a very consistent pattern. And that's very useful, I think, for social scientists, because then you can think, okay, why? What are the structural differences, the institutional and cultural factors that can explain this? And for example, it seems in South Europe that there is this culture of staying at home much longer than in Northern Western Europe, where people are going to leave for education, for university, and then start moving from then on a fair bit, whereas people are much more likely to stay home in South Europe, go to university next to their home, and so forth. And I think this has some kind of self-perpetuating mechanism happening, because, as I said, what we realize is that if you migrate as a child, you're more likely to migrate as an adult, because you kind of learn how to live and enter new social context. We also found that the youngest age at which you migrate as an adult, the more you migrate throughout your life. So if you migrate at age 20 internally, you're much more likely to migrate again and again than if you migrate for the first time at 30 or 35. And pretty much if you haven't migrated by the age of 40, you're very unlikely to migrate, or perhaps you'll do so when you retire. And so, in these low mobility countries in the south and the east of Europe, the fact that children are exposed to migration seems to perpetuate a level of kind of low migration. And I'm saying this because in Asia, I think Asia is very interesting because there's so much variation between countries in the cultural and institutional system that you can actually use it as a mini laboratory to kind of understand what's going on and what can explain the differences.
Yes, thank you for raising that. I think a lot of the questions that we have are also very specific, and I will caution that Dr. Ode looks at Asia across the board in a very cross-national context. But some of the questions that I think are particularly relevant here is one on climate change. So, it's one of the biggest reasons for migration and human displacement. This is from Sardar Ahmed Shah, Osaka University, Japan, and they want to ask a question regarding the floods in Pakistan, which caused about 33 million people to migrate internally. Does your research include migration caused by environmental factors? And what would you say about this type of urban to urban or rural migration that's expected to increase a lot in the future as well?
Thanks for your questions. I'll start by a disclaimer saying that environmental migration is really not my area of expertise, but I have a lot of colleagues here because we're in the School of Environmental Sciences looking at this issue. My understanding is that, kind of the slow onset of migration change, which would be, this continual rise of temperature and stuff like that. And this is really a problem in the Pacific with all the islands there. Tend to lead more to adaptation than actually migration. So if you read even the newspapers, if you remember in the early 2000s, there were a lot of articles, alarmist articles in the news saying, be prepared for climate refugees and this huge flows of people coming away because of climate change. So in the case of gradual change, it seems that what we observe is adaptation. But I agree with you in the case of Pakistan, and this, severe events, this need to lead to displacement. And so if you, for example, in the US, there was a lot of interesting work that came out after Hurricane Katrina in 2009, I think, that really displaced 500,000 people in Louisiana and the surrounding states. And actually what they found is that, most people do return. Most people who are displaced tend to return. And I'm not sure what's going to happen in Pakistan, but, and it's the same in Australia. We had major floods. We actually have floods today happening in the south of the country. And most people will return. But I think what's really interesting from a demographic perspective is that what they found in the US is that while people return, the people who returned had a different profile than people who didn't. And so this changed the socio-demographic composition of the population. So in Louisiana, we tend to have older, wealthier, whiter people who return, whereas the poorer Black communities, African Americans, didn't return. And so all of a sudden, you have a population that socioeconomically very different. And I think the other thing demographically is that you tend to have a drop in birth as well following an event. And you can think of COVID the same. We had a drop in births here in Australia because of COVID. It's picking up. But the key question is this also babies who are not born because of an event like COVID or a flood, are they going to be postponed as just some births that are not taking place? And how, and that way, even, this event can have a long-term effect demographically by leading to these births in many cases that not only postponed, they're just not happening.
Right, thank you, Dr. Aude. I think that's a question that everyone's really trying to grapple with because we see a lot of news on climate change recently. But moving forward, I think you spoke in your presentation about how government policies really play a huge role in internal migration. So an attendee has asked, they were very interested by your remarks on the sort of domestic migration, for example, in India, where persons migrate to urban centers for work and living, for example, in Chennai or Mumbai. So do you see this trend changing with the Indian government's renewed focus on developing rural areas and importance through the self-reliance campaign? Self-reliance campaign is called Atmanirbhar Bharat. I know this is quite specific, but maybe you can also speak more broadly about the kinds of examples you've seen in government policies really changing the distribution and composition of populations.
I think it's very difficult for government to do it effectively. And there are historical examples that have worked. You know, for example, in the Australian context, we have a problem of very low small population in the north, and the government for it's, you know, and areas that are, you know, losing population, well, like regional rural areas. And for, you know, for decades, the government has tried different interventions unsuccessfully. So the latest one that I don't recommend to anyone was to actually pay people to come. They're actually paying people now to come to the northern part of the Northern Territory in Darwin and the surrounding areas. You know, maybe $15,000, and then if you stay more than X years, you pay a bit more, but it doesn't really work. It's very costly, and then you tend to have this transient population that come and leave, so it doesn't really help. But you know, there are some cases where it works. You talked about rural, you know, rural centers in India, and it looks like, for example, Sri Lanka did some extent manage to have this kind of rural programs, very targeted, that work. But I think it's really important to think about those and the effectiveness in the context of the broader economic structures and how they're changing. And at the same for Australia, it's very difficult to retain people in rural areas if there is no job. And these kind of incentives are really not sufficient. So yeah, look, I don't know enough about the Indian context, and I'm not sure if there are similar policies in Malaysia, but they're very costly and it's very difficult. This being said, as I said, Indonesia has been quite forceful, and to some extent, you know, they have this transmigration program. They displace people in the 70s and 80s from one island to another. They're changing the capital cities. They seem to be quite effective at doing this, but then you really have to wonder what the benefit versus the cost.
Right. Yeah, I think it's hard to speak to specific national contexts, but of course the board, you see your point on policies, you know, having a role to play, but also being potentially limited in that sense. I have a question from Aisha from Family Frontiers. She's asking, life is getting more challenging for the binational family in Malaysia. Much of this is due to Malaysia's very complex and decentralized immigration enforcement for visas to remain as a single family. Basically, there are some double standards with regards to citizenship for men and women in Malaysia. And so that causes some issues. So she's asking, what can the government do to avoid the collapse of the binational family unit while also protecting the country's security? Now, this is something, you know, a bit broader, so maybe we can bring it back to the topic of migration. But to that, I would like to add another layer. I think you spoke about educational selectivity and age playing a role. Does gender play a role in internal migration as well? So just relating back to gender and families, what does your research tell you about that? Thank you.
Thanks. So a lot of things to unpack in these questions. I'm not familiar fully with the Malaysian context, but it sounds like it may be like the Lebanese context I'm familiar with, because my husband is from Lebanon, that women can give the citizenship to the children, but no, men can give the citizenship to the children, but women cannot. So that's obviously a problem, and that's a political / cultural choice. That's a huge issue. But I think it's also linked back to a broader discussion about kind of family. You know, you talk about binational, but there's this broader debate about family or living apart, and they call them, so that could happen within countries. We see this increasingly, parts of the families for work reason living in different parts of the countries, or even internationally. You know, we have here example of couples split between Australia and China, Australia and Europe. That's not unusual. But again, that's very, very difficult. I think it really takes, you know, in terms of the case of Malaysia and Lebanon and policies with such, you know, countries with such restrictive policies, it really takes a lot of concerted action from the civil society in changing some entrenched cultural practices, unfortunately. But you're right, this links to some extent back to gender. Look, there's a lot of work on gender, looking at particular migration stream, whether they're marriage migration and things like this. But building on the data we had, we kind of looked at, okay, wondering how much women are represented in total migration streams all over the world. Are they overrepresented? And it's just work we started, but what we kind of found, and it's really early on, is that in countries that are kind of there's more gender equality, migration doesn't seem to play a role. You know, you're not more or less likely to migrate whether you're male or female. That's the first thing. This being said, what we found in countries where you have really high level of gender equality is that people will migrate when they're single, but once they're married, their partner, they stop migrating. And that's what's happening in Australia, because when you have really gender equal societies, both the men and the females are employed. And if you're both employed, especially if you're highly qualified, it's very difficult to migrate jointly to find work. So for example, my husband and I, we both in academia. It's going to be very difficult for us if we wanted to go to Brisbane, to Sydney or Melbourne, to both find a work. So we don't migrate, even if there's one of us has a job. Now, we thought that in countries that are highly gender inequal, there's no gender equality, then women would be less likely to migrate. But actually, it's not true. It's much more complex, and it really depends on economic structures. So what we found in countries, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries, where there's a high proportion of young females that work as domestic workers, and they're going to migrate from rural and urban areas, a single, which, you know, you'd think, okay, women are more likely to, in conservative countries, women are more likely to migrate if they're married by themselves. But actually, when you have this kind of economic structure that allow for some types of flows for single women to occur, then you still see this woman being overrepresented in this type of flows. So I think it's really complex because it sits at the intersection of gender equality and economic structures and the role of, you know, women in the labor market.
Right, yeah, it's very interesting to see how class and gender intersect to cause different migration patterns and likelihood to migrate. And I think that's something we would need to start grappling with in Malaysia, you know, talking about gender equality and things like that. Just moving forward, we have another question sort of related to this, but this is from Dr. Tay. He's asking, does religious diversity potentially affect migration as well? Do people tend to move to areas where their culture or religion is more welcomed, for example? Is that something that came up in your research by any chance?
Thanks for your question. We haven't looked at this specifically, but I have read some work coming from the United States, which I think is quite interesting, because you'd be aware that the United States is increasingly polarized. And so there is some research that suggests that actually people are migrating within the United States increasingly based on their political preferences. So I'm not, you know, this is different from religion, but still it links to, you know, moving to people who are similar to you, who have the same attitude. So it's seen that to some extent in countries where you have a certain degree of polarization, that might happen. I don't think, you know, that would happen in a country like Australia, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with the Malaysian context to comment on this, but you can think about this, how this is problematic, because this is a type of migration that could lead to increased polarization. What we see though in Australia, but that's more if you look at the micro scale, and it's the same in all countries, you stick to having this ethnic suburbs. So that's more, you know, I'm not talking about long distance migration, but this residential mobility, or you tend to see people from particular ethnic backgrounds living in proximity to one another. And on the one hand, we can argue, you know, it's really great, particularly when you have recently arrived migrants. It can provide them networks that they can rely upon to find employment. But other people argue, it's detrimental to integration, language acquisition, diversity, and so forth. So there is a lot of debate going on. But if you think of a country like Australia, there is absolutely no government intervention. This is really a social process that happens depending on personal preferences. So to answer your question, I'm not sure about religious diversity, but there is, in terms of ethnicity and political preferences, this tends to happen. And so migration can sort out and affect the composition of the population at the kind of micro level.
Right. I think that's a very interesting point you bring up in your previous research, showing you that political polarization might play a role in internal migration. I think moving forward, in developing countries like Asia, in Malaysia, for example, we're not really necessarily tracking things like internal migration. So if we were to start doing that, the census and things like that, what are some key demographic indicators do you think Malaysia should start, just to start that project, or level of data disaggregation that is needed? As a researcher, data is very important. What are the kinds of things you would like to see if a developing country were to start tracking internal migration?
So obviously that's an excellent question. And a lot of the work I do is kind of advocating for better data collection practices, particularly in Australia. Now, collecting data is very costly, and governments are under increasing pressure. And so it's very difficult for researchers and a member of, the broader civil society to pull the government for data collection. So if you look at what's happening in Europe, and increasingly in countries like Australia and the US, not the US, New Zealand, you're saying, okay, we have, and the government collects data anyway, right? It collects data through the tax office. It collects data through social security payments, through schools, through your health record. It collects data everywhere. Now, it's not collected for research purposes, but we could harness this data at a very low cost to actually understand what's going on, whether it's migration or social processes, qualities. And so harnessing administrative data is really important. It doesn't supplement the census, it's just complemented, because in administrative data, you don't have this wealth of information. You cannot know your ethnicity, your religion. The data is very coarse, but Australia, for example, has always been very reluctant to have such data because there's a problem of privacy and stuff like that. And you need to get agencies from different departments all over the country to agree. But they finally managed to this, and we now have this data set that brings all these different administrative sources together. That's being made available to researchers under very stringent conditions. But that's been compared to the census, that you can track people over time. The census is great, but it's cross-sectional. As researchers, whether we look at migration or any social processes, we want to understand change over time. And so that's very powerful. So I think if there's an area, researchers in Malaysia can advocate, is really use experiences for the countries to build these administrative data sets.
Right, I see. That's a good point. I mean, the issue in Malaysia is of at the same time, and in most countries, is access to data, even collection of data. So this will be a long conversation. But I think there's a push now for more open data in the country across the board. We have other questions. I think this is the last question on data was from a colleague from ISA. I forgot to credit them for that. Another question from another colleague from Jamil. He's bringing up some very specific, and I'll just say that Dr. Aude doesn't look at Malaysia directly, but maybe I'll paint this in broader terms. He's looking at the growing income gap in Malaysia between urban and rural areas due to slow rural development. And this is potentially a pattern that can be seen across other Asian countries as well. He's asking, how can governments in general sort of try to address this gap, likely as a result of internal migration? And uh, yeah, how can they sort of address this gap? I think we'll try to keep it more general based on Dr. Aude's expertise. Just the policy implications of this rural to urban internal migration.
Thanks, China, for your question. Yeah, it's a bit tricky because on the other hand, if people move to follow opportunities, I think really the best thing the government could do is provide educational opportunity. That's investment, and you talked about investment in your post about investment in education. That's the best asset that the government can support individuals, also people living in those regions, because I can see the point you're making, and we have the same here in Australia between rural and urban areas. But it's very difficult to support rural areas if you don't have the businesses that are there, or the investments and so forth. Now, the role of government for rural areas to actually maintain at least the population is really providing infrastructure, and that's a big debate here in Australia. How we make sure that there's sufficient infrastructure in rural areas for people to access it and live there and stay there. So I think at an individual level, it's really making sure that people have access to educational opportunities wherever they live, including rural areas, and at the same time, investing in infrastructure that supports this kind of economic growth and retain people. But yeah, it's very costly, and it's really a long-term investment.
Right. Yeah, I see your point on education. I think it also shows in your data that education really matters when it comes to internal migration. Another point, so I think it's time for another last question. This is from a colleague, Thomas. He's asking, with increased migration, do you see a corresponding rise in government or political policies based on anti-migration narratives? Something that we have been seeing pockets of here and there. And we've seen, such like you said, these narratives have gained traction in Europe and even in Malaysia recently. That's been a thing. So do you also see governments adopting more authoritarian measures to better control internal migration?
Well, thanks so much for your question. I should say it's outside my area of expertise, but I try to answer based on some of my reading of the literature and what I've observed. But as you probably heard, I'm French, but I live in Australia. And so it's really interesting for me to compare two migration systems that operate very differently and have very different outcomes. As you know, the Australian migration system is really based on a selection of migrants based on their educational profile to meet skill needs, based on business requirements and requests, and it's very successful. And so will be the Canadian system, where you have a very selective migration process that's highly controlled, and obviously it's facilitated by the fact that it's in Ireland. But it's highly successful in terms of, the outcome for migrants. If you look, migrants in Australia tend to have high level of employment, high level of income, and they integrate relatively well. But if you look at some European countries, and I'm more familiar with the French context, when it's not a selective migration process, other controls are much looser, or there is a lot of family reunification that's much more difficult here. For example, you have a very different profile in terms of your migration population that has led to a lot of problem in terms of integration, whether it's economically or socially. And so, yes, that's why you see in part, this kind of anti-migration narrative, because it's I don't know if it's a fair migration system, but it doesn't have this kind of positive outcome that there is, for example, in Australia or in Canada. So it's very complex, and look, I'm not sure what the solution, or I'm not even sure what the context is in Malaysia. But I think, yeah, that would explain why you have actually more, I don't know if you have authoritarian measures, but in Australia, every year the government sets a migration target. I'm not sure that's an authoritarian measure, but that's a way to decide how many people will be let in on a permanent basis. And so, you know, government keep on changing based on the perceived needs of the country.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a bit of a tricky question to answer as well. But before we go with time, I just want to wrap things up with a final question, maybe a sort of a big picture question. You know, I think you spoke about your research previously, that internal migration is generally a phenomenon that increases alongside potentially to some level economic development or education, things like that. In Asia, is this does this process differ according to level of economic development and urbanization? You said some countries they see lower levels of urbanization. Sorry, they've already reached a level of urbanization, so internal migration has decreased. Do you see that as a final endpoint for all countries in Asia? And you know, what is the future of internal migration where Asia is right now?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. Look, it's very difficult to say. And it's very, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, something we've really, where a lot of thinking is at the moment, and that's really beyond Asia, is whether the level of internal migration will decrease because of this kind of teleworking arrangements, for example, and people working, I don't know how things in Malaysia, but, you know, here, you know, an increasing proportion of people are working remotely. So what does it mean for people migrating if you can work from home? I think reflecting on what has happened in, you know, in Europe, North America, and Australia, where migration has gone down, this is also linked to societal changes. So as I said, we see an increasing proportion of women in the labor market. That makes it more difficult for family to migrate. We also seen an increase in the rate of divorce. It's very difficult for a divorced couple to migrate. I mean, not couple, but divorced people to migrate because now it's increasingly, at least in Australia, shared custody between both parents, and so you're really stuck in place. So you have a growing proportion of the population that actually finds it very difficult to migrate. So I think this kind of idea that we live in a highly mobile world is not entirely true.
I see. Right. All right. I think we're at time. But Dr. O, do you have any concluding statements that you would like to make with regard to this presentation?
Oh, look, I think I've spoken enough. I think probably everyone is tired of hearing me. So I think I leave it here, but I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to come and present here at ICES, and I hope to have the opportunity to engage with some of you in person or perhaps even face-to-face in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Aude. I think it's a very interesting discussion, and it's something that we need to start thinking about a little bit more. You know, there's always international migration, which always, you know, everybody's thinking about, but internal migration really belongs in the policy discussion as well. But we really thank you for your time to talk to us and answer some of our questions. I do hope we will get to see you soon. And please, by all means, reach out to ICES whenever you're in Malaysia. We can sort something out physically as well. And I also thank you to all our participants for joining us today on this morning. If you have any questions or anything about the presentation, please feel free to email us. Thank you very much for joining, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Aude.